Hey guys, welcome back. Now let's get started with our day 23 walkthrough. You guys can go ahead and read the story here. Coming to the learning objectives, the basic of network file shares, understanding NTLM authentication, how NTLM authentication coercion attack works, how responder works for authentication coercion attacks, forcing authentication coercion using link files. In today's task, we will look at NTLM authentication and how threat actors can perform authentication coercion attacks. By coercing authentication, attackers can uncover sensitive information that can be used to gain access to pretty critical stuff. Sharing is caring. We tend to think of computers as isolated devices. This may be true to an extent, but the real power of computing comes into play when we connect to the networks. This is where we can start to share resources in order to achieve some pretty awesome things. In corporate environments, network and network-based resources are used frequently. For example, in a network, there is no need for every user to have their own printer. Instead, the organization can buy a couple of large printers that all employees can share. This not only saves cost but also allows administrators to manage their systems more easily and centrally. Another example of this is file shares. Instead of each employee having local copies of files and needing to perform crazy version control when sharing files with other employees via old school methods like flash drives, the organization can deploy a network file share. Since the files are shared in the central location, it's easy to access them and ensure everyone has the latest version to hand. Administrators can also add security to file shares to ensure that only authenticated users can access them. Additionally, access controls can be applied to ensure employees can only access specific folders and files based on their job role. However, it's the same file shares that can land an organization in hot water with red teamers. Usually, any employee has the ability to create a new network file share. Security controls are not often applied to these shares, allowing any authenticated users to access their contents. This can cause two issues. If a threat actor gains read access, they can look to exfiltrate sensitive information. In file shares of large organizations, you can often find interesting things just lying around, such as credentials or sensitive customer documents. If the threat actor gains write access, they could alter the information stored in the share, potentially overwriting critical files or staging other attacks. Before we can perform any of these attacks, we first need to understand how authentication works for network file shares. In the day 11 task, we learned about Active Directory and Kerberos authentication. File shares are often used on servers and workstations connected to an AD domain. This allows AD to take care of access management for the file share. Once connected, it's not only the local users on the host who will have access to the file share. All AD users with permissions will have access to. Similar to what we saw on day 11, Kerberos authentication can be used to access these file shares. However, we'll be focusing on other popular authentication protocol, NetNTLM or NTLM authentication. Before we dive into NTLM authentication, we should first talk about the server message block protocol. The SMB protocol allows clients to communicate with the server. In networks that use Microsoft AD, SMB governs everything from inter-network file sharing to remote administration. Even the out-of-paper alert your computer receives when you try to print a document is the work of the SMB protocol. The security of the earlier versions of the SMB protocols was deemed insufficient. Several vulnerabilities and exploits were discovered that could be leveraged to recover credentials or even gain execution on devices. Although some of these vulnerabilities were resolved in newer versions of the protocol, legacy systems don't support them, so organizations rarely enforce their use. NetNTLM, often referred to as Windows authentication or just NTLM authentication, allows the application to play the role of middleman between the client and AD. NetNTLM is a very popular authentication protocol in Windows and is used for various different services, including SMB and RDP. It is used in AD environment as it allows the servers to pass the buck to AD for authentication. When a user wants to authenticate to a server, the server responds with a challenge. The user can then encrypt the challenge using their password to create a response that is sent back to the server. The server then passes both the challenge and the response to the domain controller. Since it knows the user's password hash, it can verify the response. If the response is correct, the domain controller can notify the server that the user has been successfully authenticated and the server can provide access. This prevents the application or server from having to store the user's credentials, which are now securely and exclusively stored on the domain controller. If we could intercept these authentication requests and challenges, we could leverage them to gain unauthorized access. Let's dive in a bit deeper. Responding to the race. There are usually lots of authentication requests and challenges flying around on the network. A popular tool that can be used to intercept them is the responder. Responder allows to perform man-in-the-middle attacks by poisoning the responses during the net NTLM authentication, tricking the client into talking to you instead of the actual server they want to connect to. On a real LAN, Responder will attempt to poison any link local multicast name resolution, NetBIOS name service, and web proxy auto-discovery requests that are detected. On large Windows networks, these protocols allow hosts to perform their own local DNS resolution for all hosts on the same local network, rather than overburdening network resources such as DNS servers. First, hosts can attempt to determine if the host they are looking for is on the same local network by sending out LLMNR requests and seeing if any hosts respond. The NBT-NS is a precursor protocol to LLMNR, and WPAD requests are made to try to find a proxy for future HTTP connections. Since the protocols rely on requests broadcasted on the local network, our rogue device running responder would receive them too. They would usually just be dropped since they were not meant for a host. However, responder will actively listen to the request and send poisoned responses telling the requesting host that our IP is associated with the requested hostname. By poisoning these requests, responder attempts to force the client to connect to attack box. In the same line, it starts to host several servers such as SMB, HTTP, SQL, and others to capture the request and force authentication. This was an incredibly popular red teaming technique to perform when it is possible to gain access to office belonging to target corporation. Simply plugging in a rogue network device and listening with responder for a couple of hours would often yield several challenges that could then be cracked offline or relayed. Then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden being in the office was no longer cool. Most employees connected from home using a VPN. While this was great for remote working, it meant intercepting net and TLM challenges was no longer really viable. Users connecting via VPN made it borderline impossible to intercept and poison LLMNR requests in a timely manner using responder. Now we have to get a lot more creative. Unconventional coercion. If we can't just listen to and poison requests, we just have to create our own. This brings a new attack vector into spotlight: coercion. Instead of waiting for requests, we coerce a system or service to authenticate us, allowing us to receive the challenge. Once we get this challenge, based on certain conditions, we can aim to perform two main attacks. If the password of the attack coerced to authenticate is weak, we could crack the corresponding net and TLM challenge offline using tools such as Hashcat or John the Ripper. If the server or service's security configuration is insufficient, we could attempt to relay the challenge in order to impersonate the authenticating account. Two incredibly popular versions of coerced authentication are Prince Pooler and Petit Potin. Prince Pooler is an attack that coerces the Prince Pooler service on the Windows host to authenticate to a host of your choosing. Petit Potin is similar, but leverages a different issue to coerce authentication. In these cases, it's the machine's account that performs the authentication. Normally, machine account passwords are random and change every 30 days, so there isn't a really good way for us to crack the challenge. However, often we can relay this authentication attempt. By coercing a very privileged server such as the domain controller and then relaying the authentication attempt, an attacker could compromise not just a single server but all of AD, coercing the connectee. For this task, we will focus a bit more on coercing users to authenticate to us. Since users often have weak passwords, with this approach, we have a much higher chance of cracking one of the challenges and gaining access as a user. Users are now mostly connecting to file shares via VPN, so we can't simply run responder and hope for the best. So the question remains, how can we coerce the users to authenticate to something we control? If we have write access to a network file share, we can create a little sneaky file to coerce those users to authenticate to our server. We can do this by creating a file that, when viewed within the file browser, will coerce authentication automatically. There are many different file types that can be used for this, but they all work similarly, coercing authentication by requesting that an element, such as the file icon, is loaded from a remote location. We will be using the NTLM theft tool to create these documents. So now let's go ahead and fire up a machine. So now let's open up our terminal. So now let's create a link file using the given command. Enter your attack box IP here. We know that MacGrady is a little snoopy. So let's add the link file to a network share and hope he walks right into a trap. Use your favorite file editor. You can inspect the link file that we have created. We'll now add this file to the network file share to coerce authentication. Connect to the network file share on elf share. You can use the SMB client to connect as shown below. So now let's navigate to the stealthy directory. So now we are logging in as guest user. Now let's upload the link file we generated using the put command. So here we can see that a file has been uploaded. So next we'll run responder to listen for incoming authentication attempts. Open another terminal. Now that we have the NTLM challenge, let's try to crack it to recover the new password. As mentioned before, the challenge was encrypted with the user's NTLM hash. The NTLM hash is derived from the user's password. Therefore, we can now perform a brute force attack on this challenge in order to recover the user's password. Copy the contents of the NTLM version 2 SSP hash portion to a text file called hash.txt using your favorite editor and save it. Then use the following command to run John to crack the challenge. So here in this command, we are telling the tool that this is the word list to use and this is the hash to crack. While we wait, use your connection to the network file share to download the key list he has left us as a clue using the getgreedies.txt. Okay, let's do that. So here we have the file. Let's download it using get. So as you can see here, we have downloaded the file. So here we have the hash. Let's copy this. So now let's create a new file called hash.txt. Now let's copy this. So here we have cracked the challenge. After a few seconds, you should receive the password. Take back control by using the username and password to authenticate the host via RTP. So coming to the questions, what is the name of the AD authentication protocols that makes use of tickets? So that is Kerberos. What is the name of AD authentication protocol that makes use of the NTLM hash? So that is NetNTLM. What is the name of the tool that can intercept these authentication challenges? So that is Responder. What is the password that McGreedy set for the administrator account? So let's paste it here. What is the value of the flag that is placed on the administrator's desktop? So let's go. So now we have completed our day 23 walkthrough. Thank you for watching my video and stay tuned for more.